Okay, so today's really come as a response to a lot of requests to have some very clear direction on some of the conversational tips. So today's agenda, we're going to look at a typical conversation, how it occurs, and we're going to have a quick look at the 3 steps to reaching people overview, and then we're going to look at the tips. And then we're going to have a Q&A. So there is some prior knowledge that will be useful, but it's not essential for today. But there's just some of the things that you may want to look at. Is we've got a lot of videos on what we determines what drives behavior. The role of emotions in perception is very, very important because so many of people's decisions and their behaviors is based on emotions. In fact, it's always the key to whatever we decide. There's a decision model, which we explain how the manipulation via the behavioral sciences occur. We show a lot of information on how we're influenced and conditioned, and we've got something on how to debate, which is very useful because a lot of people say, they've got the ideas in their mind, but they don't know how to articulate it. That session that's on the website on how to debate will really show you how you can learn to really articulate your points very clearly. It becomes very useful because when you're explaining something to someone, when you articulate it clearly, they really respond much, much better. And then obviously the ethics and the goal of the project all on the various other videos that we have done. So a typical conversation invariably will go something along the lines of, we have Joe blogs and Jane blogs. And Jane will present a fact, and if they have different belief systems, the fact will bounce off nearly all the time. This is one of the things that's really confused people, and it's really why we explain why logic, reason, and facts just have not been working. Pretty much most of the conversations are driven by the emotions underneath. We really need to understand that. So effectively, this little slide shows us that in most conversations, what actually happens is that we stand on the soapbox. The soapbox represents our knowledge, how we see the world, what we think about it, our belief systems, etc. And generally in a conversation, what will happen is that we just project out into the conversation our belief systems. Now, if Jane and Joe's belief systems are different, then all that's going to happen is that they're just going to, talk on for hours, trying to convince the other person that they're correct. If Jane presents, 2 plus 2 is 4, and Joe believes it's 5, all they're going to do is talk all night about it's 5, it's 4, it's 5, it's 4. And this is one of the biggest problems that's going on. So if Jane does have the correct answer to the mathematical equation, she actually has to find a way for that information to make it into Joe's soapbox. Once that information's in there, then Joe will have a different perspective of that information. Until it does, the conscious reasoning is not going to have much of an effect. And that's, I think, very apparent for us all to see. So just a quick overview of the 3 steps of reaching people. Effectively, the most important thing that you're going to find when you're talking to someone is our mindset, our approach. If our mindset is off, we're not going to have much success. Then it's really the conditions of the conversation. If the conditions are not set up correctly, again, there's going to be a very little success in actually having a nice, open, honest conversation. And then the way in which we share information. So we've summed up pretty much the project into one of these 3 categories. And they're in this order. So the mindset has to happen first, then the conditions, and then the sharing. If you just jump straight into sharing, then it invariably will have little success. So we have a goal that we may want to have an open and honest conversation or share information. Once these 3 things are aligned, then invariably we'll have a nice conversation. And that's been apparent by the success that we've had conversations go recently. So what tends to happen a lot of the time is someone's mindset will be off balance, or the conditions, or the form of sharing. Okay, so a quick example of the mindset. So if we are feeling threatened, or the other person's feeling threatened, the mindset's really off and nothing's going to work. If we are in opposition to each other, so if somebody thinks they're red and the other, this is the tribal colors, as it were, someone's Labour, someone's Conservative, it really doesn't matter what you say, you are considered in opposition. They're going to pretty much dismiss everything you say. So really, and David Bone wrote a whole book on this called On Dialogue. It's very, very powerful. And of course, if we present just raw facts to someone that has a different understanding of that fact, it's going to be rejected nearly every time. This is something we really have to understand, how we share information. And obviously, one of the big tips we say comes from Jerome Bruner's research, but if you wrap a fact in a story, it will stick 22 times more effectively. The unconscious mind loves stories, which is obviously why the media is so effective. So, saying that, some acknowledgement I think is really, really key. Is one, it's unfair, basically. The fact that we have to attend calls and we have to go to lengths to understand why so many of the conversations are not working is unfair to a degree. Now, the fact that when we do understand why conversations aren't working will actually be very enriching to our lives in general, but it will enable us to understand what's going on and it will answer a lot of questions. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that, because if you have two people in a conversation and one person is unwilling to assess why the conversation is not going well and they just assume they're correct and the other person's wrong, then obviously they're not going to have any input to the success of the conversation. So the fact that we want to take the higher ground to say, okay, something's not working here, how can I make it work? So always worth making that point. Those now challenging the narrative have been abused, misled, harassed, called all sorts of names. Okay, there's a lot of people that when I do various interviews, people will have a lot of strong emotions come up and they'll be very derogatory to the people not challenging the narrative, you know, call them all sorts of names. Those emotions are understandable. They very much are. I really listen, I understand them. I've had them in the past myself to varying degrees. Here's the thing though, if we don't resolve those emotions, the conversation is going to be very challenged. So I think really just to acknowledge that, you know, it has been unfair. We have been called all sorts of names if we just ask simple questions, but just to allow that to be. And then learning how to reach people brings control back and learning and transcending the issue. So it's really about, okay, this isn't working, that's not working. How can I actually get a nice conversation occur? And of course, every item I advise to navigate is a mistake I've made numerous times. Okay, everything that I'm touching on is really, you know, I would have done so many times and then just, you know, researched it and learned from it. So one thing to touch on . So one thing just to notice is the fight or flight. We try and bring a bit of comedy in where we can because it's obviously quite a serious subject. So when people go into the fight or flight, when they've been triggered, rational mind shuts down. If that occurs in a conversation, we're really not going to have much of a good conversation. And of course, invariably, we will see a gorilla. People will go from very nice, polite people to very agitated in a very short space of time. So we're just going to represent this gorilla in certain conversations to see, you know, when this happens, what we're saying is the person has gone into the fight or flight. And we've done some videos on what really happens here, but effectively it's when, you know, we're under physical threat, you know, the rational mind shuts down, our heart races, all these various physiological responses. But when the ego is under threat, the same thing can happen. So they're not even a physical threat. When there's a perceived ego threat, the same thing will occur. So one, because there's so many of the tips to go through, we're only going to go through one set today. And on the mindset, there's really one that I want to touch on, but it's a very difficult one. And those of you that come to the Tuesday nights will know how important this one is. And it's really a mindset in the sense of, if we think about someone we wish to have a conversation with, and we imagine metaphorically there's a communication channel between us, invariably, it's been my experience talking to most people that are having a challenge talking to another person, there will be lots of emotions blocking this channel. And that's quite understandable with the stress we've been under. But one of the greatest successes you'll have in really having good conversations is actually to clear the communication channel. And that's what we do on a Tuesday night. The whole thing's dedicated to it. We use EFT, but there's many, many different techniques that people can use to really resolve and deal with these emotions. Just the fact of talking to someone about how we feel can also have a bit of a release from these. But once that communication channel is clear, you'll find that all relationships will just improve. It's been my experience like all my relationships with my friends and families improved significantly when I just really focused on this. So let's get on to some of the concrete ones now. So hopefully this is one thing that we should know not to do, but telling someone they're brainwashed is not very good. This is what you will see invariably if you ever utter these words. You'll then probably be told that you're joining a cult, and then we probably have our gorilla come out as well. And this is really, you know, the gorilla's coming out because there's a perceived threat. So really the tip is do not trigger the gorilla, okay? And trying to get these sort of really catchy things so it sticks in us. When I'm talking to someone, I'm really navigating their ego so often. I don't want to put them into a position where they feel defensive or they feel attacked in any way, because once someone does feel that way, they're not going to be open and really engage in the conversation. So it's really learning all the different trigger words, all the different types of things that we can say that really won't be respectful. They won't really respect a person's dignity. We have no responsibility for how the person responds, in the sense of, you know, if they're rude to us, it's not to return the dignity violation. And what can happen is, if you don't get dragged into the rudeness, you can often pull the person out very quickly. Donna Hicks has done a lot of work on how to respect person's dignity. So the second one is, obviously, we've all seen this at marches and everything else, where someone will just be very aggressively, you know, take off your bloody mask. I don't think that this works hardly ever. You know, we often, you're just going to trigger someone into a fear response. So, you know, there's this threat, which is really either the physical or the ego. You know, you're either going to trigger the gorilla, so you're going to see someone really coming back at you quite aggressively, or you're going to see them really go into this fear response and want to get out of the conversation very quickly. And once they're under one of those two things long enough, they just freeze. And obviously we want very open, honest conversations. So it's very, very key not to have the other person feel under threat. And what happens is, the less we do that, the less we get threatened. I mean, I can't actually not remember the last time someone called me a conspiracy theorist or any of the other things, because you can really learn just to navigate those situations very well. So what are the 3 words that will trigger the gorilla the fastest? You are wrong. I would advise never using these words, because effectively what you are wrong is saying is like, you are wrong as a person. If you ever do need to point out that someone's facts are incorrect, really separate the idea of the facts from the person, because this is one of the semantic errors that we make in language. That, you know, we say, oh, you are this, or you are that, or I am this, or I am that, and it's not. Our identity is very vulnerable to these words. And of course, if you do use those words, you'll invariably get attacked straight back. So really, I never use these words. I often don't use no or anything else, because they're just because the times we're in at the moment is that people are what I term as highly conditioned. There's very sensitive emotions around a lot of the subjects that we're talking to. So people are very on sort of eggshells as it is. So we need to be very gentle. Next one is any of these labels. So you're a sheep, you're a conspiracy theorist, you're brainwashed, you're an anti-this, anti-vax or pro-vax, all these things. The divide and conquer is so powerful and it's so pervasive, and it's really driven by labels. So the structure of divide and conquer is classification, identification, and then comparison. So what you'll find is that people are looking for a group identity. And of course, you know, we've been given them at various times over the last decade. The Brexit was a classic example. So people were either a Remainer or, you know, a Brexiteer or whatever they were. So they were given 2 camps. What happened was that each person then, you know, they were classified as camps, and then a person identified with which camp they were in. Then there was this comparison. So the other camp was wrong. You know, and obviously life is never that black and white, but that's what it was painted as. And then of course one side is painted as being, you know, racist or whatever the other labels they attach to them. And then that's when you get into this comparison, this morality going on. So what happens is one of the most unsane things we can do as human beings is actually identify with labels that are not really useful. And this is why the anti-vax and the pro-vax labels are very, very problematic. The minute that two groups are seen as an opposition, they will dismiss everything from the opposing group. So if someone does label you as an anti-vaxxer, the very first thing that you must do is to challenge that in a very gentle way. What I usually do, right, I don't get called it anymore, but when I did, it was like, well, what do you mean by anti-vaxxer? You know, if you ask someone to define what they mean, invariably they actually don't know, and they become quite vulnerable. And at that point, be very supportive and just talk through, because you want to get to the position where you're allowed to challenge an idea. And of course, that idea is not allowed to be challenged until those labels are transcended. So you'll see this everywhere. The whole divide and conquer is driven by actually having these labels attached. And there was a very beautiful story that Robert Sapolsky talks about in one of his TED Talks. And it's what happened in 1914 in no man's land. So you had the German and the British soldiers obviously fighting each other, and they called a truce. And he explains that the reason they had the truce because there were so many bodies in no man's land that were having trouble, you know, fighting each other. So they had this truce, so both sides know that they're not going to fight. So then they went into no man's land and they started recovering the bodies. And then what happened was that the German soldiers started helping the English soldiers and vice versa. And they started helping, you know, in the really icy ground to bury the bodies. And of course, what happened was that when they started working together, they transcended these labels, these symbols. So then, in fact, they started celebrating Christmas together. And then they even had the football match. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine that after months and months of fighting, all of a sudden, in the space of hours, they've started to work together, and then they started to exchange addresses to keep in touch. For them, they didn't want to fight anymore. They transcended the labels. It actually took officers coming into the trenches to threaten to shoot the soldiers unless they carried on fighting again. So, although divide and conquer is so very powerful, to unite people can happen very quickly. And once you transcend these labels, it happens so quickly. So I give you one other story that was really beautiful. I'd heard from a doctor friend of mine, John, and he had been, by his own words, really triggering people and not really getting through to them. And then recently he sat down, he was on an event, and there was 70 people there, and him and his wife were the only two people not wearing masks. He went to sit down at a table, and he said, "Can I join you?" to this lady, and she said, "Most definitely not. You know, you're not wearing a mask, and I've heard you also are not vaccinated." And rather than respond, he just listened. And he said, "Oh, may I ask you, you know, what makes you say that?" And he just listened, he just listened, he just listened. And he sat down, he talked to him. He said by the end of it, the lady was smacking him on the shoulder and laughing and joking with him. He didn't actually state many facts or anything, but what happened in her mind is that she had switched from him being the enemy to actually he's not. And sometimes actions can speak so much more than words that he could never express that in words. And it was such a beautiful story when he told me. And of course, so in her mind now, she's really going to be questioning, are they these non-mouse words? This guy was a doctor. You know, maybe I'm not being told the truth. So I find that really my experience has been by being very friendly to people, smiling and seeing them as another human being beyond these labels is one of the most powerful things we can do. So one of the next tips is do not step in the ring. This had a very profound effect on those of you that have seen that story of the lady in the park, that Rachel, who was responding or talking to her, it was those words that stopped her basically triggering her gorilla. So invariably when you're talking to people, these labels, they're trying to label you something. Yeah, and invariably once they've labeled you as the opposition, they want to step in the ring. They want to fight you metaphorically in language. You'll see very aggressive responses from a lot of people. There's a lot of people on social media where they, you know, you can really see and feel the emotions coming through what they're writing. But effectively, if we can see that we're in their corner, if we can really embrace this metaphor, we can really understand that, you know, the person's seeing us as opposition, which is why they're responding that way. And if we can really show them via our words and our actions we're not, we're actually in their corner, this will shift very quickly. And then we can really follow through to start to really share some very valuable information. So in summary, really clearing the communication channel will be one of the most powerful things that we can do. Really need to avoid triggering the gorilla. Don't trigger the gorilla. And you'll know, really when you really observe this, you'll know at the points where you will do it. You'll know the words that will trigger it, and just the observation of it. You'll feel, that's what I said. And soon enough, you'll have enough experience not to trigger it. Avoid this sort of threat. Now, a lot of this is actually unconscious. And I tell people a lot of the stories that I spent one evening clearing the communication channel that I had when I thought about talking to people wearing masks. So initially in the pandemic, people wearing masks was really jarring for me. It was very unsettling. So I had some various emotions of anger around it. I spent one evening just getting through it, resolving them, tapping them away. The next day I was out walking with my dog, and then suddenly, lots of people in masks were coming up and stroking my dog and talking to me, and I was like very taken back. It took me a few minutes to realize, I wonder if that's because I let go of all those emotions the night before. People, you know what it's like if you're in a room or you're with someone and they're angry at you, you can feel it. You really can. And of course, we've all experienced that where we've been in a situation around the narrative. If someone very clearly knows we have difference of opinion, you can almost feel those daggers. If we can release outside of these emotions, that's really one of the biggest things. And that's why I think so often this threat thing actually activates before a word is said. We've joked on calls before where if you imagine the two ends of the spectrum, so you've got one person holding a big sign saying, they're trying to kill us, and then at the other end you have someone, wearing 3 masks, gloves on, mask on their dog. Those two people look at each other. They don't have to say a word. They've already orientated and they don't like each other. That's what happens. So I think this threat thing is very much an unconscious thing. And of course, once we let go of the blocks of it, people really will respond. This navigating the ego is very, very key, particularly with the scientists. When I look at and I talk to them in the way that they would debate things, it's very understandable to know why Max Planck said science moves on one funeral at a time. Ideas, when we have established ideas, we do not feel comfortable having them challenged. It really feels like the rug is being pulled from under us. So it's very important to navigate this ego. You are wrong is the quickest way of triggering it. And then of course we have these transcending the labels. So it's very, particularly from our perspective, I don't identify with any of the typical labels that the media wants to provide. I don't think but at the same time, some of for instance, I have not taken the experimental procedure, and I don't plan ever on doing so, but that doesn't make me anti those things. I don't plan on taking any of them, but that still doesn't make me anti them. Yeah, there's this balance where you can have a decision not to do something, but it doesn't make you anti it. And as RFK said, he says he's been trying to get mercury out of fish, but that doesn't make him anti-fish. So yeah, it's really a key point to understand. And the last one is do not step in the ring. So really you'll really know that when someone's trying to pull you into a ring, it's really because they've identified that you're in opposition to them and they want to, attack your ideas and attack you. And invariably what happens is that they attack the person and not the idea, because often they don't even understand the idea. So you'll see this time and time and time again. And one of the ways to know that you're in opposition to someone is that they will just resist everything you say. So if you presented 4 facts and 3 of them were like 100% solid, but the last one was had a little bit of question about it, if they zero in on that one, that's an idea that they're in opposition to you. They're not willing or want to be in open dialogue. They want you to be wrong. That makes sense. So they're looking at why your idea is wrong. You'll notice that when you're not in that type of conversation, they won't zero in. It'll be an open conversation about the conditions. Okay, so and what I've changed to do now is that I've realized that some of the presentations are too long. So we're trying to shorten them now and have a bit more time for Q&A. So we really absorb key information. So yeah, all the presentations in the course are free. If you have benefit, you would like to donate, please do so at this place. And I'm going to open it for Q&A.